The first rays of the morning sun spilled lazily over the sleepy town, painting the narrow streets in soft gold. Birds chirped from the rusty wires above, and the faint scent of fresh bread drifted through the cool air. At the corner of Maple Street, tucked between a weathered bookstore and a flower shop with chipped paint, sat a small, cozy diner. Its window steamed slightly from the heat inside, and a faded neon sign flickered gently, "Mornings made better." Inside, the diner hummed with the quiet rhythm of early risers. The linoleum floor creaked under worn shoes, and the clatter of dishes mingled with the hiss of the coffee machine. Behind the counter, she moved with practiced grace, carrying plates, pouring steaming mugs of coffee, and smiling at everyone who entered. She was petite, with a simple apron tied neatly around her waist, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid that swung slightly as she moved. There was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet warmth, the kind that made strangers feel seen even before they spoke. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," she said cheerfully, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and toast toward an elderly man hunched in his usual booth. "Thanks, Clara," he replied, his voice raspy but kind. "You make the mornings worth waking up for." Clara smiled, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, almost as if she were thinking of someone else, someone she couldn't quite reach yet. She moved to the next table, nodding at the young couple chatting over pancakes, and exchanged a quick laugh with her coworker, Jake, as he flipped the coffee pot. "Looks like another busy day," Jake joked, leaning on the counter. "Busy enough to make a difference," she said softly, her gaze drifting toward the door for just a moment. Outside, a man sat on the curb, shoulders hunched, hands tucked into his worn coat. His presence had become a quiet part of her mornings, though no one else seemed to notice. And here, if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this incredible tale. Trust me, it only gets more emotional from here. The diner's warmth wrapped around her like a familiar hug, but her thoughts wandered beyond the clatter of plates and the hum of conversations. Every smile she shared, every cup of coffee poured, was routine to some, but for her, it was a reminder that kindness didn't always announce itself. Some things mattered quietly, in small gestures no one else might see. As she wiped down the counter and glanced at the door again, the bell above it jingled softly. She caught herself smiling once more, adjusting her braid, as if bracing for another day that could be ordinary to everyone else, but full of little moments that mattered deeply to her. And somewhere just beyond the diner's window, her morning routine was quietly waiting to change, though she didn't yet know how. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Clara stepped outside, the warm air of the kitchen slipping away behind her. Morning had fully arrived now. The street was awake, buses groaned as they pulled to the curb, shopkeepers lifted metal shutters, and the smell of fried dough from a nearby cart mixed with the crisp scent of early autumn air. Near the brick wall beside the diner, exactly where he always sat, was the man. He kept his back straight despite the thin blanket draped over his shoulders, his hands folded patiently in his lap. His beard was untrimmed, his coat frayed at the cuffs, but his eyes, dark and tired, held a quiet dignity. He never asked for anything. He never knocked on the door. He simply waited. Clara slowed her steps, pretending to adjust her apron as she glanced his way. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small, respectful nod. "Good morning," she said gently, as if greeting an old neighbor. "Morning, miss," he replied, his voice low and careful, as though he didn't want to take up too much space in the world. She slipped back inside for a moment. The diner buzzed on, unaware. A plate appeared in her hands, warm eggs, toast wrapped neatly in a napkin, and a cup of coffee with the lid pressed on tight. No one noticed when she carried it back outside. No one ever did. She knelt beside him and placed the meal carefully on the ground, just close enough for him to reach. "I made sure it's still hot," she said, smiling. His fingers hovered for a second before touching the plate, as if he were afraid it might disappear. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You don't have to do this every day." Clara shook her head. "Everyone deserves breakfast," she replied simply. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, while she stood nearby, pretending to straighten the trash bin or wipe the window. This wasn't charity to her, it was routine. A small, silent promise she kept every morning. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "You're a good person," he said, not looking up. She paused, her hand resting on the diner door. "I'm just doing what I can," she answered. Inside, the bell rang again, pulling her back to work. Outside, the man finished his meal, warmth spreading through him, not just from the food, but from the rare feeling of being seen. And as the city moved on around them, neither realized that this quiet exchange, this unnoticed kindness, was being woven into something far greater than either of them could imagine. By mid-morning, the diner was at its loudest. Plates clinked, chairs scraped against the floor, and conversations overlapped in a familiar, messy rhythm. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, catching dust in the air and illuminating everything, especially what people chose to notice. Near the counter, two regulars leaned close to each other, their voices low but curious. "That's the third time this week I've seen her do that," one woman murmured, nodding toward the window. "Feed that man," the other replied, frowning. "I don't understand why she bothers. There are shelters for people like him." Behind the counter, Clara pretended not to hear as she wiped the same spot twice. Her coworker Jake glanced at her, then followed the women's gaze outside, where the homeless man sat quietly, finishing his meal with careful bites. Later, during a brief lull, Jake leaned in. "You know people are talking, right?" he said, not unkindly. Clara met his eyes. "Let them," she replied softly. "Talking doesn't cost them anything." Outside, the street buzzed with life. A delivery truck rumbled past, children's laughter echoed from the corner, and shopkeepers stood in doorways watching the world go by. Some looked at Clara with approval when they saw her step outside again, this time carrying a folded jacket. "That girl's got a good heart," an old man muttered from his bench. "She's wasting her time," another voice snapped back. "Kindness won't fix the world." Clara ignored them all. She draped the jacket gently over the man's shoulders. He looked up, startled. "You don't have to." "It's getting colder," she said, adjusting it so it fit better. "I'd worry if you didn't have it." He swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you." From across the street, a group of neighbors watched in silence. Some felt admiration stir uncomfortably in their chests. Others felt annoyance, her kindness forcing them to notice what they preferred to ignore. When Clara returned inside, whispers followed her like shadows. She felt them, of course. The sideways looks. The hushed judgments. For a moment, doubt flickered across her face as she tied her apron tighter, her shoulders sagging just a little. Then she remembered the man's eyes when she handed him food. The way his hands trembled, not from hunger alone, but from gratitude. Her back straightened. That night, as she locked up the diner and glanced once more at the quiet street, she realized something simple and powerful: people would always have opinions. But kindness, once given, didn't belong to them. And tomorrow morning, she would be there again, no matter who was watching. Days passed, then weeks, measured not by calendars but by quiet routines. Each morning arrived with its own weather and mood, some days wrapped in pale sunlight, others heavy with gray clouds and damp air. Yet one thing remained unchanged. At the corner of the street, beside the diner's brick wall, Clara always appeared. Sometimes she brought a warm breakfast tucked carefully into a paper bag. Other days it was leftover soup sealed in a container, steam fogging the lid as she handed it over. Once, on a particularly cold morning, she returned with thick gloves and a woolen scarf, the kind her mother used to knit. "I don't need all this," the man said gently, his voice still hesitant, as if kindness might carry a hidden cost. Clara smiled as she wrapped the scarf around his neck. "You don't need much," she replied. "But you deserve warmth." The city moved around them in fragments, horns blaring in the distance, footsteps echoing on pavement, leaves skittering across the sidewalk. In that small space, time seemed to slow. They began to talk, little by little. At first, it was just polite exchanges. Then, gradually, stories emerged. He spoke of a life he once had, simple work, a small room, evenings spent listening to the radio. He never shared how he lost it all, and she never asked. Some truths, Clara understood, didn't need to be pulled into the light to be honored. She told him about growing up in a nearby village, about her father teaching her that kindness was the only wealth that never ran out. If you have food, he used to say, you're rich enough to share. One afternoon, rain fell hard and sudden. Clara ran out with an umbrella, holding it over his head while water soaked her sleeves. He laughed softly, surprised. You'll catch a cold, he warned. Worth it, she said, grinning. With each passing day, something changed, not just in him, but in her. His shoulders seemed less heavy. His eyes held more light. And Clara, though still tired from long shifts and small paychecks, felt fuller than she ever had. There were no grand gestures. No speeches. Just steady presence. Food placed gently beside him. A greeting that never failed. A moment of human connection in a world that rushed past too quickly. One morning, as Clara turned to leave, he said quietly, "You remind me that I still exist." Her steps slowed. She looked back at him, her eyes soft. "You always did," she said. And as the seasons edged forward and the city kept changing, neither of them noticed that someone else had begun to notice too, watching these small acts, quietly measuring a heart far bigger than it appeared. The morning sun slanted across the street, golden and gentle, lighting up the small brick sidewalk where the man usually sat. Clara stepped out of the diner, her apron still tied neatly, the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee clinging faintly to her. But today, something was different. He was wearing a jacket that looked newer, less frayed at the cuffs, and his shoes, though still worn, had been wiped clean. His hair was combed back, and for the first time in weeks, there was a small, almost shy smile playing on his lips. Clara's heart lifted at the sight, though she tried to hide her surprise behind her usual calm demeanor. "Good morning," she said, holding out the paper bag of food as if it were any ordinary day. "Morning, Clara," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. He reached for the bag and paused, looking up at her. "You always make the mornings better," he said quietly, as if admitting a truth he had only recently noticed. Clara's lips curved into a soft smile. "That's what friends are for," she said, adjusting the bag in his hands. The city around them went about its usual chaos. Cars honked, a street vendor shouted greetings to his customers, and the smell of fresh bread and pastries drifted from a nearby bakery. Yet in that small corner, time seemed suspended. The man ate a small portion of the food slowly, savoring each bite. His hands no longer trembled as much, and his eyes met hers without the old, wary hesitation. "You've been coming every day for me," he said between bites. I don't know how to thank you." Clara shrugged, kneeling slightly to meet his gaze. "No thanks needed," she said softly. "Kindness doesn't always need a reward. Sometimes it's enough to see someone smile." For a long moment, they simply watched each other, the quiet acknowledgement between them speaking louder than words ever could. He adjusted his jacket and glanced down at the food, then back at her. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a glimmer of hope, a spark of pride, a sense that life could still hold small joys even after hardship. Clara rose to leave, brushing crumbs from her apron. "See you tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying the promise of continued care. As she walked back into the warmth of the diner, the man stayed behind for a moment, savoring the feeling that someone had believed in him when the rest of the world hadn't. And in that simple act, the daily offering of food, warmth, and attention, Clara's quiet kindness was starting to bloom into something far greater than either of them had imagined, a gentle shift in the rhythm of their lives that hinted at new possibilities just over the horizon. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply, slicing through the steady hum of conversation and clatter of dishes. Clara looked up from the counter, her hands still damp from wiping down a coffee spill. A man had entered, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, polished shoes reflecting the morning light, and a silver watch glinting on his wrist. There was something about him that made the chatter in the room feel smaller, muted, as if the world had shifted just slightly. He didn't approach the counter. Instead, he moved with quiet precision, taking a seat in the far corner where he could watch the entire room without drawing attention. His eyes lingered on Clara, not with scrutiny, but with curiosity, as though he were studying someone performing a delicate, intricate work that few people noticed. Clara felt a slight prickling at the back of her neck, an instinct she tried to ignore. She forced a polite smile and walked over, coffee pot in hand. "Good morning, sir. What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden tension. The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Just observing for now," he said smoothly, his accent hinting at a world beyond this small town, distant and polished. "But I might have a coffee in a moment." Clara nodded, unsure how to respond, and moved back to her work. She kept an occasional glance in his direction, noting the way he didn't disturb the flow of the diner, didn't comment on the small imperfections that everyone else seemed to notice, the chipped cup handle, the faded linoleum floor, the slightly crooked chairs. He simply watched. Around them, the regulars carried on, some throwing curious glances at the stranger, whispering quietly to each other. The tension was subtle, invisible to most, but it hung in the air, an unspoken question that everyone felt but no one voiced. Clara poured coffee for a nearby table, her hand steady despite the uneasy awareness of the man in the corner. Something about him felt different, important. He wasn't here for breakfast or idle chatter. His presence carried weight, a quiet intensity that made her pulse a little faster. Outside, the street continued its usual rhythm. Delivery trucks groaned down the narrow lanes, pedestrians hurried past the flower shop and bookstore, the faint aroma of baking bread drifting through the morning air. But inside, the diner seemed to shrink, the noise fading into background static, leaving just Clara and the man, two figures bound by a curiosity neither had yet acknowledged. And somewhere deep in the quiet observation, a sense of inevitability began to stir, the feeling that this unexpected visitor might be the first spark to change everything, quietly and irreversibly, in their ordinary, unnoticed world. The diner had begun to thin out when the man finally stood. His chair slid back softly, the sound barely noticeable, yet Clara felt it before she heard it. She turned from the counter just as he approached, his presence calm but commanding, like someone accustomed to being listened to without ever raising his voice. "Excuse me," he said, offering a courteous nod. "May I have a word?" Clara wiped her hands on her apron, uncertain but polite. "Of course," she replied, motioning toward the counter where the noise was quieter. Up close, she noticed the fine details she hadn't before, the subtle lines at the corners of his eyes, the confidence in his posture, the faint scent of expensive cologne that didn't belong to this modest place. He placed a business card on the counter but didn't push it toward her. "I've been watching you," he said gently, as if aware how strange that might sound. Not in a careless way. In an interested one. Clara stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. "Watching me do what?" she asked. He glanced toward the window, where the street stretched out under the midday sun. "Helping the man outside. Every day. No cameras. No applause." She followed his gaze, then shrugged slightly. "He's hungry," she said simply. "So I feed him." The billionaire studied her face, searching for something more, an explanation, perhaps a hidden motive. "Most people walk past him," he said. "Some feel sorry. Others look away. Why don't you?" Clara took a breath. Her thoughts drifted to a small village not far from the city, to a wooden table where her family once shared meals that were sometimes small but always shared. "I was raised to believe that what we have isn't really ours unless we're willing to share it," she said. "If I can help, even a little, then I should." He leaned back slightly, visibly moved. "You don't expect anything in return?" She smiled, almost embarrassed by the question. "I already get something," she said softly. "I get to see him smile. I get to know someone's day was better because of me." For a long moment, the billionaire said nothing. The hum of the diner filled the space between them, the clink of a cup, the distant sound of traffic outside. Then he nodded, slowly. You remind me of something I once forgot, he said quietly. Clara tilted her head, confused but intrigued. And what's that? That real wealth, he replied, has nothing to do with money. As he picked up his card and finally slid it toward her, a quiet certainty settled over the counter. This wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of a door opening, one that would soon change far more than either of them expected. The afternoon light had shifted by the time they spoke again, casting long shadows across the diner floor. The billionaire stood by the counter, his jacket now draped neatly over the back of a chair, as if he, too, had decided to stay a little longer in this small, unremarkable place. Clara poured him the coffee he'd declined earlier, her hand steady, though her heart beat faster than she cared to admit. I've thought about what you said, he began, his voice calm but weighted with intent. About sharing what you have. Clara nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. It's just how I live, she replied quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, placing it gently on the counter between them, as if it were something fragile. I run several foundations, he said. Most of them started with good ideas but lacked the right heart. Yours doesn't. She glanced down at the paper but didn't touch it. I don't understand, she admitted. There's a vacant storefront 2 streets over, he continued. Small. Modest. I'd like to fund a community kitchen there, nothing extravagant. A place where people can eat without being judged. I want you to help lead it. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Clara felt her throat tighten. Me? She asked, almost whispering. I'm just a waitress. That's exactly why, he replied. You see people. You don't measure them by what they can give you. Her thoughts raced, long shifts, barely enough savings, the quiet worry that followed her home every night. This offer felt like a door she'd never even known existed. I wouldn't know where to start, she said, doubt creeping in. You already have, he said softly. Every morning. Clara swallowed hard, blinking back emotion. Outside, the city moved as it always did, buses rattling by, clouds drifting lazily across the sky, completely unaware that something life-changing was unfolding inside this diner. There's more, he added. A salary. Enough for you to breathe without counting every coin. And resources to help the man you've been caring for, and many others. Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed her palms against the counter, grounding herself. I never did this for recognition, she said. I know, he replied. That's why it matters. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara nodded, slowly, a smile breaking through her disbelief. Not for herself, but for the possibilities. For the lives that might change. As they shook hands, the bell above the door chimed softly, and the sunlight spilled in again. What began as a quiet act of kindness had grown into an opportunity far greater than either of them imagined, and its impact was only just beginning. The change didn't arrive with banners or speeches. It crept in quietly, woven into ordinary days, until one morning the diner felt different, lighter somehow. The same chipped mugs lined the counter, the same bell chimed at the door, yet something unseen had shifted. Clara noticed it first in the smallest moments. A customer slipped extra coins into the tip jar and said, for the man outside. Jake, her coworker, stopped grumbling when Clara stepped away and instead covered her shift without being asked. Even the whispers had softened, turning into thoughtful silences. Outside, the street told its own story. The homeless man, now wearing clean clothes donated by neighbors who once looked away, no longer sat with his shoulders hunched. He stood some mornings, greeting passers-by with a nod, offering to help carry boxes for shopkeepers or sweep leaves from the sidewalk. Didn't you used to sit here? A woman asked one day, surprised to see him helping an elderly man with groceries. I did, he replied with a small smile. Someone helped me stand again. The neighborhood began to respond. A baker left unsold bread wrapped neatly at the diner's door. A teacher from the nearby school organized a clothing drive. Children waved as they passed, their curiosity replacing fear. One afternoon, Clara watched from the diner window as the man knelt beside a trembling stranger, another soul worn down by the streets. He offered half his sandwich, speaking softly, the same way she once spoke to him. "You don't have much," the stranger said cautiously. He smiled. "I have enough." The city seemed to breathe differently now. The sounds were the same, traffic, laughter, distant music, but they carried warmth instead of indifference. Even the gray walls looked brighter beneath creeping vines and fresh posters announcing the soon-to-open community kitchen. Inside, Clara poured coffee for a table of regulars who had once judged her. "You know," one of them said, stirring slowly. "You started something bigger than you realize." Clara shook her head, smiling. "I didn't start it," she said. "I just didn't ignore it." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and painted the street in amber light, Clara locked up the diner and stepped outside. The man stood nearby, laughing with a group of volunteers, his voice stronger, his presence sure. Their eyes met across the sidewalk. No words were needed. Kindness had multiplied, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, proving that when one person chooses compassion, the world doesn't just notice. It follows. And tomorrow, something even deeper was waiting to unfold. The diner was quiet in a way it rarely was. Evening had settled over the street, and the last customer had left with a soft jingle of the bell. Clara moved slowly now, wiping the counter, stacking chairs, letting the familiar motions guide her thoughts. Outside, the city exhaled, traffic softened to a distant murmur, streetlights flickered on one by one, and a cool breeze carried the scent of rain and warm bread from the bakery down the block. She paused by the window and looked out at the sidewalk where it had all begun. The brick wall, the narrow curb, the place where one man had once sat silently each morning. It seemed impossible that something so small, an extra plate of food, a cup of coffee, a kind word, could lead to so much change. Clara rested her hands on the counter and smiled to herself. She hadn't planned any of it. She hadn't hoped for recognition or imagined her life turning in a new direction. She'd only followed a quiet instinct, the same one her father used to speak of when they shared simple meals in their little village kitchen. "If you can help," his voice echoed in her memory, "then you already know what to do." She stepped outside and locked the door, the key clicking softly in her hand. Across the street, laughter rose from the community kitchen's open windows, voices blending, pots clanging, life moving forward. The sound filled her chest with a gentle warmth. Clara adjusted her jacket and began walking home, passing neighbors who nodded at her with newfound respect. "Good night," someone called. She waved back, her smile easy, unchanged. At the corner, she stopped briefly, watching the streetlights glow against the darkening sky. Somewhere nearby, someone would be eating a warm meal tonight. Someone would feel seen. And tomorrow morning, the routine would begin again, coffee brewing, plates warming, the bell over the door ringing just as it always had. She realized then that the true miracle wasn't the opportunity or the recognition. It was the fact that kindness, once given, had grown beyond her hands, and yet had never asked her to become anyone different. Clara took a deep breath, feeling gratitude settle quietly in her heart. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady and real. And as she walked on, carrying the same humble spirit that started it all, the city seemed to walk with her, proof that even the smallest daily kindness can leave a mark that lasts far longer than we ever imagine.